In the beginning of Dark Souls' Age of Fire, there was the Ringed City, home to the Pygmy Kings who shared among themselves fragments of the dark soul of mankind. This was their city, though they did not build it. The small envoy banner's item description reads, "The small banner used by envoys of Great Lord Gwyn in the days of yore. Face the ringed cliff and hold the banner high to summon facilitators of transport." For the Pygmies, who took the Dark Soul, the Great Lord gifted the Ringed City, an isolated place at World's End, and his beloved youngest daughter, promising her that he would come for her when the day came. But he never did. Gwyn's love affair with mankind was a ruse, part of a scheme cooked up by the fearful king to ensure the permanence of his lineage. After the first flame arrived and introduced disparities into the world, Gwyn collected the Soul of Light, the most powerful soul and the one most in harmony with the sense of the world as it currently existed. But life is dynamic and its favor is fickle. Fire fades, and so the Age of Dark is an unavoidable successor to the Age of Fire. Gwyn faced the inevitable stream of history and tried to alter its flow. His corrupting of the natural order is the root cause of the horrors in the world of Dark Souls. He didn't change the makeup of the world on a fundamental level, he just grafted a system onto it which diverted the energies of men into perpetuating his age instead of pursuing their own, which assaulted those who tried to embrace the dark, and which deluded mankind about the nature of the world, such that the fire-linking system came to be seen not as a perverse addition, but as a fundamental truth of the world itself. With time, the natural flow was forgotten, and people and institutions began to believe that fire-linking was all there was and could be. They live in disharmony with the world, perpetuating a dynasty and a way of living whose mandate and harmony with the world has long since passed. And the disharmonious living is where pain is born. For all are governed by the great cycle of the world. You cannot avert or alter its flow, you can only delude yourself and others about it. And until the origin of suffering is uncovered and the root cause is confronted, suffering will continue to permeate existence. And mankind will be destroyed for refusing to ask themselves whether it was all necessary. An eternity of torment turns out to be preferable to expanding the mind. In this video, I'm going to be discussing the cycle of the world, or Wheel of Life, as it is represented and contextualized in the games of From Software in depth. I'm going to go beyond just pointing out that it's there though. I'm going to talk about the general theme and branching ideas and how they are formatted around the unique quirks of these games. Before you watch any further, you should know that this is the 4th of 5 videos I'm doing on the Themes of Fromsoft, and that I really suggest watching the series in order if you haven't already. So start with a video on impurity, then enlightenment, then madness. I'm AesirAesthetics. Hope you have a cup of coffee on hand. Let's dive in. To live is to suffer. Then death, then rebirth, so you can suffer some more. Caught in the wheel. The proper Buddhist term is the Wheel of Life, but for this video I have opted to use Cycle of the World to describe the phenomenon, because the representation of the idea is twisted around the specifics of the games I'm discussing, and I don't want to conflate the actual Buddhist idea with the ideas I believe it inspired in these games, both on the big and small scale. So fire linking is an entire discipline, but the same idea is seen in the Executioner's Chariot. A literal cycle, or wheel or ring, is there, and its presence showcases perpetual suffering, until of course it, or a person's relationship with it, is ended, at which point they can move on. The Wheel of Life is a wheel because existence is cyclical. You can start looking into it from whatever point you want, the actions and their causality will always make sense. The wheel has 4 layers which illustrate different parts of the process. In the center of the wheel, we have the 3 poisons: attachment, aversion, and delusion. The wheel's second layer, counting from inside out, showcases karma. In life you perform good and bad deeds, and in death, the collected karma is tallied up and dictates where in the Buddhist realms you would be rebirthed. The Buddhist realms are sixfold, and the 6 realms of existence are displayed on the wheel's 3rd layer. The outermost layer of the wheel showcases the 12 links of dependent origination. It illustrates the ways in which suffering is born from ignorance and craving. Behind the wheel is Yama, the god of death. His presence is meant to represent impermanence and how death is inevitable. He's the Miyazaki of Buddhism in that sense. And finally, above the wheel is the moon, symbolic for enlightenment. It is above the wheel because enlightenment is how one escapes from the cycle of suffering. In Dark Souls, the dead do not rest, but rise again as the undead. This is owing to the Darksign. Its item description reads, "The Darksign signifies an accursed undead. Those branded with it are reborn after death, but will one day lose their mind and go hollow. Death triggers the Darksign, which returns its bearer to the last bonfire rested at, but at the cost of all humanity and souls." Humanity, or the Dark Soul, is the vital essence of the race of men which links them all together and is owed to their shared progenitor, the first pygmy. It can seemingly be split endlessly without losing its potency. Originally, human beings were immortal, and the idea with the Darksign was that it would burn off the excess power of men and put an end to their lives. And the humanity, which would have been split among their descendants or claimed by their next of kin, is instead lost. As the Age of Fire has weakened, the ability of the Darksign to extinguish the life of the branded is gone, so they rise again, but without the souls they've imprinted upon. The Darksign's item description in the second game reads, "An accursed mark. Use its power to return to the last bonfire rested at the cost of all held souls. Like a moth drawn to a flame, those branded with the Darksign are fated to be consumed by fire over and over and over again. This is the only fate permitted to them." The Darksign is an imprint of the cycle of the world. The Order of Gwyn is literally a ring burnt into the flesh. The human being is immortal, but because of the order they live in, they suffer, die, and are reborn into more suffering. This is similar enough to the way Buddhism frames the nature of suffering to make a connection, but in Dark Souls, the escape which mankind is offered is a lie. The center of the Wheel of Life showcases the 3 poisons, / the 3 fires of the Buddha, which are at the root of all suffering because they cause attachment. The root of suffering in the world of Dark Souls is the fire linking system. In Buddhism, a person which surrenders to attachment is lit aflame. In Dark Souls, a person who surrenders to the Order of Gwyn is lit aflame. And the suffering of the cycle of the world is perpetuated for another age. The presence of the fire linking system offers the undead 2 choices which both lead to their doom. Find the will to go on and link the fire, or surrender and lose your souls, your mind, and your humanity and become a hollow. But even those who have the will to go on can go hollow. They continue to suffer even when they achieve their goals, and when this contradiction becomes too great, they snap. However pious a person is in an incorrect framework, it's still an incorrect framework, so their piety is wrong as well and can't deliver them anywhere. The undead believe that the misery which has befallen them is linked to the fading of fire, and so in a futile attempt to undo the suffering which afflicts them, they try to relink the fire by collecting a great number of souls and offering them and themselves up to the first flame as kindling. Ludologically, the idea of the will to go on is expressed by the player as well, since the difficulty of the game can overcome them and cause them to give up on the experience. In-game, only the strong can endure the deaths which face them, be revived and push forwards over and over again until the fire is finally linked. That is, until the fire fades again, which is when the undead will once again be called upon to seek soul power to relink the flame. Mankind's nature is the dark, and so if they were left to their own impulses, their attraction to the dark would organically lure them from the Age of Fire. And so Gwyn relies on orthodoxy to keep the fire aflame. Moral doctrines are written, and people are taught what they need to think is right from what they need to think is wrong in order to perpetuate Gwyn's power. Just like how the will to go on narrative is represented with gameplay, the sin mechanic is as well. It is less conceptual, though. When you do wrong by other humans, you accrue sin, and if you want to be forgiven, you must find a pardoner. This ensures that those who do wrong are kept outside of the Order of Fire, such that they cannot taint it, and if they want back in, they must pay a soul penance equal to the sin they have committed. Gwyn's organization is hierarchical in the extreme, with the Golden City of the Gods literally standing above the rest of the world. The prophecy of the chosen undead instructs for them to ring the bells of awakening and reach Anor Londo. To reach those bells, the undead must travel between the different elevated planes of existence. Those visits will have the undead meet one another, and a characteristic shared by almost everyone in the world of Dark Souls is how suffering and delusion seem to be the natural states of men. Those who suffer cling to the myth of fire-linking as the means to bring about their salvation, and men search within themselves for the guiding light which leads them to the ultimate destination.
I have come to this great land, the birthplace of Lord Gwyn, to seek my very own son. Finally, I have found it. I have. My very own son.
Their suffering is characterized differently from one another because these people have different ambitions from one another. All the same, these ambitions can't in any way overcome the root cause of their suffering, and so they indulge themselves in their delusions or give up.
Well, what are you going to do? I've already decided. I don't really care. I'm simply crestfallen.
The greatest delusion of them all remains the fire-linking system, and so most undead march to link the flame. But they're not acting alone. Kingseeker Frampt leads the undead who have proven their valor by ringing the bells.
No, I'm fine. Well and wide awake. Do not treat me like an old withering snake.
But he is a snake. An old snake from before the world we know, who lures mankind away from the correct path with promises of a kingly reward. Alongside Frampt, there are institutions which Gwyn set up to preserve the Age of Fire, to help those who seek soul power to kindle the first flame once more. The cycle of the world, the fire-linking system, is managed by Allfather Lloyd and Frampt on the front end, and Gwyndolin in secret. Lloyd rules the church and celebrates those who do right. Frampt guides the would-be chosen undead and contextualizes their efforts to them to be in harmony with a virtuous end. Gwyndolin leads assassins and punishes those who do wrong. This structure and the fire-linking system is what Gwyn left to his firstborn to govern when he left to ignite the first flame for the first time with his soul. Managed properly, this structure has the capacity to preserve the Age of Fire for untold eons. But Gwyn's firstborn abandoned the throne, and with time his daughter abandoned the Golden City as well. And now the machine Gwyn built waits for the chosen undead to overcome the hardships of the world and supply it with the energy it needs to continue living and thwarting the destiny of mankind for another age. Everyone and everything is contained within the Wheel of Life. Organically, you're linked to it by desire, but in Dark Souls it's not so simple. There is still a cycle governing the flow of life, birth, death and such, but it isn't an organic phenomenon. It is imposed on mankind by Gwyn in an effort to avert the natural flow of the world. In these games there's always a cycle of suffering, but it is not always an imposition like it is in Dark Souls. All of these games explore the beauty and horrors which a breached world boundary can create, and the subversion of the organic force in Dark Souls is all towards the fire-linking system. Mankind is branded with the cycle, and their humanity, the source of their power and right to rule the Age of Dark, is being burnt up to propagate the bonfire system and perpetuate the life cycle of the Age of Fire. That's the False Order. And it is willing to accept human champions. Likewise, although Gwyn subjugated and enslaved the giants, if a giant wants to link the fire, they can. There's a deep systematized doctrine of sin and forgiveness embedded in the religion of fire. Whatever transgression an undead makes, they can seek to be pardoned, except if they blaspheme. Oswald of Carim will forgive any sin except the dispelling of the illusion of Guinevere. And once the illusion is dispelled, Gwyndolin will send assassins after you. The Order of Fire cannot exist on its own merit any longer. Violence is needed to ruthlessly impose it. The Buddha teaches that suffering can be born from ignorance. If you live in harmony with the false order, as the people in Dark Souls do, you will suffer. You will die, be revived, and suffer, over and over again until you start to question the fundamentals of the world and discover what the root of suffering is. In Dark Souls, the root of suffering is Gwyn. The subversion of the natural flow of the world creates Kagare. Many tried to discover ways in which to live in this corrupted world, but people's understanding of the cause of pain is corrupted because they take the fire-linking narrative at face value. There's a reason linking the fire is always the most obvious ending, and the dark ending is always kind of hidden. Because it is how you put an end to the cycle. But before you can do that, you have to suffer in it, die in it, and be reborn in it, again, and again, and again. And then, when you've finally met with the one who guards the first flame, you can link it and restart the flow all over again. But you're not supposed to. You're meant to put an end to the pain and the Age of Fire. That is the basic idea of the cycle of the world, as it relates to Dark Souls anyways. Now, if you're satisfied, feel free to sign off here. Maybe leave me a like for my troubles. But if you want to get even deeper into the esoteric with me, get another cup of coffee and keep watching. For FromSoft, the Cycle of the World theme did not originate in Dark Souls. Its implementation there is an elaboration and evolution of the way it was used in Demon Souls, and arguably Armored Core. In Demon Souls, like in Dark Souls, we start by creating our character and then we go through the tutorial where we fight off some soul-starved enemies. A big point of separation from Dark Souls and Demon Souls at this point is that in Demon Souls, you will die, one way or another. But we don't pass on. After dying, we awake in the Nexus and learn that we have been linked to it by the Monumental, to help her stop the scourge of the demons. The link ensures that when we die, we do not pass on, but instead are resurrected over and over again. In Dark Souls, the link to suffering, death, and rebirth was displayed with a non-droppable inventory item, the Darksign. But in Demon Souls, it was the Nexial Binding. And right off the bat, I want to emphasize that in both games, the literal manifestation of our link to the cycle of the world is a ring. A brand seared onto our flesh to burn off the excess humanity, and a shackle which confirms that we are a prisoner, in a sense. Expect the image of a ring, or a wheel, to show up a lot when we discuss suffering going forwards. The reason I opted to start the video by talking about Dark Souls, even though Demon Souls came first, is because I think Dark Souls has the most interesting exploration of the theme across these games. Take this for example. Traditionally, in Buddhism, the cycle of suffering is born from human impulses. In the case of Demon Souls, this holds. Men study the soul to acquire power. Then the old one is awoken, and soul arts are revived with him. The human hunger for power becomes a demonic hunger for souls. The hunger for souls feeds the old one and destroys the world, and after enough destruction has occurred, a hero emerges to put the old one back to slumber, thus ending the scourge of the demons and revoking the power of the soul arts from the world, until the cycle is restarted. And it will be restarted because the human appetite for power hasn't been ended, and once the destruction is far enough in the past and well and truly out of living memory, the despair will be the stuff of pseudo-history and myth, and someone will indulge their impulse for power. In Dark Souls, the cycle of the world is not an organic function of human nature. Sure, it's people's ignorance of the true nature of the world that causes the misalignments in living, which is the cause of their suffering. But the ignorance isn't born from humanity, they were lied to and led away from the proper path, and institutionally brutalized into submission to the false god and his dying age. The conflict of Demon Souls is the conflict of clarity and power, as well as the tendency of men to do the work of demons. The world can be pure or impure, and people can be people or they can be demons. The game isn't super clear on the distinction, which I think is sort of the point. The conflict in Dark Souls doesn't pit mankind up against itself in the same way. You can blame the horrors there on Gwyn in a way you just can't blame the horrors in Demon Souls purely on Elant. Elant was the one who awoke the Old One, yes, but the Old One didn't send messengers in the night and poison people's minds. Humans are acting the same they always have in this world. And the endings play on the human or demon conflict. The Maiden in Black and the Monumental want to put the Old One back to slumber, but our Soul Arts mentor Freyk meditates on this and urges us to kill the Maiden in Black and absorb the soul of the Old One for ourselves. If we follow his path, the suffering in the world can be amplified for personal gain. And interestingly, he says,
The Old One is an unfathomable deposit of energy. It contains all the souls collected by the demons. You will gain the power of a king, and I will gain knowledge from beyond.
Like Frampt did when he was leading us astray, Freyk specifically promises us the power of a king. If we put the Old One to slumber, the soul which it absorbed will be lost and the destruction will persist. But the spread will end along with the soul arts, and people will be given the chance to rebuild. In any way the story concludes, we are prompted to replay the experience with our held items and souls. In that sense, the cycle repeats. If we absorb the power of the Old One, we are given a large sum of souls, as well as the Beast Demon's soul. It looks sort of like a blurred skull, and it has no use other than being popped to collect 200,000 souls. It gives us some strength, but with the escalating difficulty of New Game Plus cycles, this reward is less and less impactful on every run. If the player chooses to put the Old One back to slumber, they receive the Maiden in Black Demon's soul. It pops for 60k, but it can be traded for the Soul Sucker magic, which insta-kills any non-boss it touches, and doubles the number of souls dropped. Obviously, that reward in the long term is much more valuable than the flat 200k we get from the bad ending, but there's something else. In the slumber ending, the player also takes the place of the Monumental and stays within the Nexus, using his power to mend the fractured fabric of reality, as well as to guide whoever comes next when the cycle of the world repeats. The cycle of the world in Demon Souls is born from the innate impulses of humanity itself. The cycle of the world in Dark Souls is born from a lie which abuses the innate impulses of mankind and weaponizes them against mankind itself. The ramification of this is that Dark Souls' cycle can be remedied. In that sense, Demon Souls has a much bleaker attitude towards human nature and life than Dark Souls does. There's no character in Demon Souls as cruel as Gwyn, and no suffering as unjust and evil as what the Darksign and the firelinking system does to people, but that it is imposed on the world means that humanity can shrug it off in a way they can't do with the Old One. The Old One was created by God to cleanse the world, but it might not be so simple, because the Old One isn't active unless it is awoken by the demonic hunger for souls which people have. God gave men souls before creating the Old One. Maybe he saw that appetite in them and decided to remedy the problem without taking the souls back. The soul gives men clarity and free will, so rather than restrict men, God created the Old One to punish humanity should they allow the hunger for souls to overcome them. And so, they still have the freedom to indulge their worst impulses, it's just that there's a cost associated with it. The Old One will always be there, waiting for the day people are willing to become demons. The firelinking system, although it does significantly more damage and across a much greater period of time, doesn't have the same inevitability. I think it's clear where I stand, but whichever cycle you count as more malicious among these two games, what they share is a binary conclusion. In Demon Souls, the cycle can be perpetuated, or it can be arrested. In Dark Souls, the cycle can be perpetuated, or it can be ended. This is not true to conventional Buddhist teachings. There, you're not put in a physical opposition with the wheel of life or the suffering in the world. They are meant to be overcome, but that's not a victory you can achieve for humanity as a whole, it's personal, and it's done by reaching Enlightenment. Enlightenment is such a broad topic that it already warranted an entire video dedicated solely to it. But as extensive as I tried to make it, there were things left unsaid. Specifically about dreams and the notion of escaping the cycle. The first thing we do in Bloodborne is to watch a cutscene where a scourge beast arises from a pool of blood, only to be repelled by fire as messengers appear, and the doll says,
"Ah, you found yourself a hunter."
The scourge beast was not literally there. Instead, it is a representation of our own creeping beasthood, which is pushed back when the moon presence links us to the hunter's dream. The hunter's dream is an anchor point, just like the Nexus was in Demon's Souls, and the bonfires are in Dark Souls. In place of the Nexial binding and the Darksign, in Bloodborne, our link to rebirth and suffering is the hunter's mark. It does not have a ringed shape like the previous links did, but the hunter's dream was created by the moon presence, and the hunter's mark is her rune. So, there's still something ring-shaped in our link. After we wake up, we read a note that tells us to seek pale blood to transcend the hunt, which is a really good hint into what the game actually means. The moon can represent tranquility and a peaceful mind, but Bloodborne plays very hectic and stressful. There's a kind of assault on the senses at all times which you need to overcome, just like how the hunters need to overcome the beasthood within them. The text more literally translates to seek the pale blood in order to end the hunt. And I will contend that the hunt in Bloodborne is the cycle of the hunt. Like the cycle of the awakening of the Old One in Demon's Souls, like the cycle of firelinking in Dark Souls, this is the cosmic loop which mankind is fated to suffer in.
Over and over again.
The desire for enlightenment leads people to hunt the Great Ones. Then they hunt for the old blood to ascend, and when they fail, they're made to hunt the beasts, which are born from the consumption of the old blood. From the archaeological expeditions we can undertake in the world of Bloodborne, it seems to be inevitable that all cultures aspire to ascendance, and then they all fall prey to the cycle of the hunt. The Hunter's Rune can be found deep in the Chalice dungeons, suggesting that communion has happened before, long before, and continually since. And the overarching narrative of ascendance and degeneration is also showcased in the Chalice dungeons, supporting the idea that the cycle has persisted for much longer than we may at first realize. Even the microcosms of the cycle re-emerge as the best practices are rediscovered by different cultures. For example, repeatedly the civilizations in the game are matriarchal, because women can bear the children of the Great Ones. That's all the Great Ones seem to want, so dangling prospective birth mothers in front of them seems to be the best trick mankind can figure of reaching out to them. Another cultural microcosm repeated across the eras is beast hunting. The degeneration of the old blood and the spreading of the beast plague, that is, the transformation of the populace into beasts because of unenlightened people consuming the boundary-blurring old blood, results in these societies needing to establish institutions of beast hunting. The Thumerians are even shown using trick weapons. And if you wanna go even more specific, the Labyrinth Warrior is wearing the same kind of one-eyed helmet Walter is. Lauren fell to the beasts. Ys ascended near the cosmos. Yharnam itself is being torn to shreds by the conflict of beast and kin. History repeats because every culture wants to ascend. That's the cycle of the hunt. And on the innate or imposed binary, we can see that, like in Demon's Souls, the cycle of suffering and rebirth here is clearly being born from the impulses of mankind. And that goes further than just the broad narrative, mind you. The smaller, localized NPC stories also showcase human nature creating suffering through a cycle, or wheel. In Bloodborne, Bergenworth and the Healing Church seek communion with the Great Ones. Ascension requires a great deal of insight, but there's something else you need. Third umbilical cords. Those are created as precursors to the actual umbilical cords to children of humanity and the Great Ones. To generate these cords, Women must be impregnated by the Great Ones and then the courts harvested. These courts grant ascension, but they also grant communion and treaties with the Great Ones. Civilizations rise, they select great women to lead them into communion, and then they try to ascend even higher. When the scourge of the beasts hit Yharnam, the Healing Church employed the hunters to deal with the problem. They thought. But the beasts are a symptom of the old blood. Killing them only prolongs the problem, and as it persisted, beasts got bigger and more dangerous, so the hunters needed a leg up. Lawrence and Gurman constructed the hunter's dream as a refuge for hunters, but to precipitate the meeting with the moon presence, they needed to offer up a third court to it. The court they chose was the one from Canehurst, so they sent the executioners of the church to the place and destroyed it just like Bergenworth did to the fishing hamlet long before. Alfred is the only lucid executioner of the church we meet, and his weapon of choice is the Logarius wheel. Its item description reads, "Weapon wielded by Martyr Logarius's band of executioners, used to slaughter the vile bloods in Canehurst, bathed in pools of their blood, and forever steeped in their ire. Transform to release the power of the wheel and manifest their lingering rage in a show of utter brilliance. Forever steeped in their ire, for eternity as befits the manifestation of the tormenting cycle of the world." Or, again, wheel. The wheel shows up a few more times as well. The wheel hunter's badge item description reads, "Martyr Logarius led a band of executioners, and this badge was crafted at their dedicated workshop." The wheel symbolizes righteous destiny. Their workshop was a secretive enclave of mystical beliefs and heady fanaticism which served as the backbone of the executioner's unique brand of justice. Acquiring the Wheel Hunter's badge unlocks the Logarius wheel for purchase, but it also unlocks the Gold Ardeo, and its item description reads, "The odd helmet worn by the band of executioners commanded by the Martyr Logarius." The conical gold helmet, symbol of the executioners, represents luminosity, ambition, and an unflagging resolve to face impurity, staring it down with stern golden spirit. As the great Logarius once said, "Acts of goodness are not always wise, and acts of evil are not always foolish. But regardless, we shall always strive to be good." The executioners had a structured belief system, but what is good in their eyes? The elimination of impurity? The vile bloods seek blood dregs for their queen, and their communion rune is corruption, though a cleaner translation would have it be called impurity. The impurity is the transgressing of the sacred boundaries of the world, but that is precisely what the Healing Church is after as well. Both the Healing Church and Canehurst indulge in the old blood in hopes for a celestial ascension and the birthing of Great One children. The executioner's ethos is hatred of the vile bloods, and after killing Martyr Logarius and encountering Annalise, we can lead Alfred to her, where he will slaughter her with the wheel. But she will not die. That would be an end to her suffering. She can be rebirthed and made to endure the torment of the world forever. It's pretty overt symbolism. But then, so was the wheel corpse in Latria, and so are the bone wheel skeletons in Dark Souls. And all three of these are Berserk references. How about that? The cycle of the hunt is born from and perpetuated by the organic impulses of mankind. There are some great ones pulling the strings here and there, but the people can opt out of the suffering if they really wanted to. But they want to ascend, and so they birth the suffering. In the Enlightenment video, I discussed the idea of enlightenment as putting out the flames. That's the literal translation of the word nirvana, and the flames are the flames of ignorance, the flames of attachment, and the flames of aversion. In Dark Souls, rather than putting a flame out, humanity collectively is perpetuating it and are burning themselves up to do so. In Bloodborne, this imagery comes up again, in Lawrence. He sought enlightenment, and to the end of reaching it, he created the Healing Church. But he lost his humanity, and now he lingers in the nightmare as a cleric beast lit aflame. He reaches out for the sanity he lost, but he will never recover it, because enlightenment has slipped out of his fingers, so now only death will put out his flames. But he could have ascended. And that's a major difference between how Bloodborne tackles the idea of the cycle of the world and enlightenment, and how Dark Souls does. Because in Bloodborne, there are ways of actually lifting yourself out of the cycle and reaching a higher, more celestial consciousness. In Dark Souls, there isn't. You either perpetuate the cycle of suffering, or you end it. The potential resolutions of the plot in Bloodborne are threefold. After Murgo has been silenced and the nightmare slain, we meet up with Gehrman in the dream, and he offers to set us free. If we accept, he will kill us and sever our link to the dream. We wake up in Yharnam to a sunrise, and assumably the cycle will repeat itself when the pieces are all in place. If we reject Gehrman's offer, he will fight us, and if we win, the Moon Presence descends and selects us as its new sentinel. We replace Gehrman as the administrator of the Moon Presence's cycle. To overcome this ending, we must have ingested 3/3 umbilical cords. In that case, when the Moon Presence tries to embrace us, we repel it just like we did to the Scourge Beast in the beginning of the game. We then fight, and after killing the Moon Presence, the cycle ends, and us and the doll take our first steps into a new celestial life. An enlightened state of being is reached after the moon is vanquished, which might seem like a contradiction to the idea that the moon represents enlightenment, but this isn't the only moon that disappears in Bloodborne, and the idea of vanishing moons and the cyclical nature of life is so ubiquitous across the series that there's even a universally applied term. Dark Moon. The beginning or end of a lunar cycle. When the moon presence in the hunter's dream disappears, the cycle of the hunt has concluded. When the moon in the hunter's nightmare disappears, the suffering of the old hunters is ended. The Dark Moon grass in Demon Souls is a perfect heal and cure for everything. It resets the player, just like the celestial childhood in Bloodborne does. A child can go anywhere and do anything unbound from the previous rules of the world. In Dark Souls, this idea is explored with Gwyndolin and Seath. Both are born to an order that is failing, and both emphasize in their makeup the instability of that order because they lack its characteristic features. Seath is born without scales, Gwyndolin is born without an affinity to the sun. He also breaks the whole nameless king equals masculine warrior god, Guinevere equals feminine fertility goddess binary. But as I've gone into in this series already, instead of embracing their connections to the moon and their innate disassociation from the governing cycle of the world, instead of striving for enlightenment, they cling to the order that birthed them. Seath destroys himself looking for immortality when he was blessed with a temporal existence and the ability to move on. Gwyndolin is the final firekeeping adherent and perpetuates the Way of White long after all the other gods bailed, and in the end he is eaten by a fire-linking prospect which the system he dedicated his life to created. The cycle will not love you back, no matter how much you want it to. Rejuvenation and transcendence can only be achieved when you are no longer attached to it. That is how suffering is averted. I keep contrasting the birth of suffering in Dark Souls to the other titles, and I really want to emphasize that it is different. The same human nature perpetuates the cycle in all of these games, but Dark Souls is unique because the cycle was imposed rather than being an organic outgrowth of human beings acting upon their instincts in the world. If Gwyn hadn't done what he did, suffering would have been averted. But judging by what we can see in the prehistories of these games, if Alant had not revived the Soul Arts, someone else eventually would have. And if Lawrence had not gotten the people drunk on old blood, someone else would have. In the non-Dark Souls games, it's always emphasized that the cycle is a naturally forming phenomenon given human nature. The cycle of the world in Sekiro is the cycle of the dragon's heritage. Children are born blessed with the immortality of the Sakura dragon. These children can choose champions to share in their immortality, and the militant forces of Sengoku-era Japan all recognize and aspire to obtain this power for themselves. Before Wolf and Kuro, there was Takeru and Tomoe. Before Genichiro fought the forces of the Interior Ministry, Ishin did. Sekiro's utilization of these Buddhist ideas is perhaps the most straightforward in any of these games. Partially because it's set in Japan, so they can just use the names and symbols of the Buddha and those who study under him. But partially, it's because Sekiro was the first of these games to really give us a core cast of clearly defined characters whose motives we don't need to go diving into pages of item descriptions to understand. I want to discuss a few stories in the game to illustrate something. Our link to the cycle was established by Kuro sharing his blood with us after we had been murdered by our adopted father Owl in the Hirata estate incident. The suspicious placement of Interior Ministry elite forces suggests that they were behind the assault, and although Wolf is blamed for the failure to protect the nobles, the fault lies with Owl. Owl is an interesting figure. Firstly, his long hair is braided similarly to the Shimenawa rope we can find in the shrines. Those symbolize clouds and signify sanctity. Owl wearing his hair the way he does suggests that he is sanctified. You might be mistaken for taking that characterization at face value considering all his talk about codes and loyalty and such, but his fighting style and placement in the story betray all of that. He uses trickery and underhanded moves to win, and for all of his posture to the contrary, he has no honor. The promise of immortal life was enough for him to murder his own son. Wolf has 2 story-significant deaths in the game. Chronologically, the first was being murdered by Owl, but as the game unfurls, the first death we see is his confrontation with Genichiro at the start. Genichiro also has ambitions for the immortal life of the dragon's blood. Ashina is dying a slow death as the forces of the Interior Ministry keep hitting harder, and the land's vitality is being drained. Genichiro is an orphan adopted by Ishin and raised to lordship. He's now tasked with preserving the land, and his attachment to it is great enough that he will do anything to do this.
そのためなら俺は人間をやめよう。
But the stagnation that has befallen Ashina is the result of the dragon's heritage. The very force Genichiro deludes himself into thinking can give him the power to overcome the threats from outside. After being murdered by Genichiro at the start of the game, we meet the sculptor. Long ago, he was the shinobi of Lord Ishin, and in that time he spilled untold volumes of blood for his master, and Shura was born within him, a demonic force which compels the afflicted to destroy. Ishin arrested this development by cutting off the sculptor's, then called orangutan, cutting off his arm, and since then he has devoted himself to carving the Buddha to overcome the dark karma he had accumulated and suffocating the wrath within him. Once the Interior Ministry invades, however, the demon will be released and the pent-up hunger for killing will find an avenue for expression once more. These 3 stories illustrate 3 separate ways for people to link themselves to the cycle: attachment, ignorance, and aversion. The cycle of the dragon's blood is not born from any of these instances, and although Owl and Genichiro clearly do connect to the cycle of the dragon's blood, the sculptor doesn't, not really. All the same, these men are all linked to suffering by these poisonous desires they have. And as I tried to emphasize in the Madness video, these ideas link a lot of characters to suffering across all of these games, but once again, I want to note that Dark Souls is different because it's not the people in opposition to the order or cycle of the world born from their innate impulses and nature. It's people in opposition to the lie which Gwyn imposed on them. In previous titles, the generic enemies were mad husks or beasts, but in Sekiro, these guys are actually lucid. Their suffering isn't in the depletion of their minds, though there is some of that here and there. It's in the zapping of their spirits and in the endless cycle of violence inherent in the warlike nature of life in Ashina. If there is a great lie in Sekiro, like the fire linking system in Dark Souls, or if there's a great delusion, like how in Demon Souls the miracles and sorceries both owe to the Old One, I think it would be the unquestioned belief these people have that immortality is desirable. Life is meant to end. Buddha teaches that decay and death are inevitable, and that those who cling to existence are attaching themselves deeper to the cycle of the world. For Seath in Dark Souls, his mortality was unique among dragons, and it gave him the ability to actually escape the cycle. Would he pursue enlightenment? In Sekiro, the existence of immortality brings out the worst in people because it seems to be an answer to the problems they face, and all it costs is their ability to escape the cycle as well as the depleting of life energies from everyone else. Because, as I've noted many times on this channel already, in Sekiro, immortality is always presented as parasitic. Those who live forever do so by feeding off of others. The immortality also conflicts with the samurai honor code of the fighters here, and because it's a breach of a sacred boundary of life, it's a seedbed for Kekare. Hanbei the Undying is a showcase of both. He obtained immortality and so was unable to follow his master into death. When Wolf acquires the immortal blade, Hanbei asks for a final duel and then asks to have his immortality revoked. Like with many other cases of immortal severance in the game, this has Wolf pull a centipede from Hanbei's body and kill it. Centipedes are a sign of Kekare, and that killing it ends the immortality makes it quite clear that immortality is impure. People's life energies are tied to the life force of the impurity within them, end the impurity, end the person. I briefly mentioned this already, but before Wolf and Kuro, there was Tomoe and Takeru. Takeru was the dragon's heir, Tomoe was his shinobi, and when Kuro starts researching immortal severance, he learns about them. Takeru tried to achieve purification, and it was likely then when the previous dragon rot epidemic Emma tells us about occurred. Their efforts in eliminating the impurity of the land was for nothing because the cycle continued upon their deaths. So, interesting thing about immortality, it isn't permanent. Tomoe's note reads, "A note written in Tomoe's soft handwriting. Lord Takeru's coughs are worsening still. Returning to the divine realm is hopeless, and I wish only to sever the dragon's heritage and restore his humanity. Restoration requires the Everblossom and Immortal Blade, and yet I cannot acquire the letter. It was hidden by the High Priest of Senpu Temple, who has no desire to sever the immortal ties." Takeru was beginning to have bad coughs, and Kuro has those coughs as well. He blames the dust, but it's actually a sickness. His and Wolf's, and Takeru's, and Tomoe's before. Their lives are linked to the life energies around them. When they die, they drain the ambient life from their environment to restore themselves, and that's dragon rot. But when the ambient life forces have been parasitically depleted, eventually the dragon's heir and his shinobi also die, and the dragon's heritage is passed on to another. Takeru and Tomoe were caught in the cycle of the world, and they were killed by it. But they wanted to end the cycle, and in our time, so does Emma. While we adventure, Kuro works with Emma to uncover the secrets which Tomoe and Takeru discovered, and in the end, that research can or cannot pay off depending on how we choose to resolve the conflict. The best ending, if we accept that the suffering is born from the immortality of the dragon, is to give Kuro the frozen tears at the end, allowing the divine child of Senpu to absorb Kuro's spirit, and she and Wolf will then travel together to Korea to return the Sakura dragon back to its homeland. Since the dragon is gone, so is the immortality, and Ashina is freed from the stagnancy of non-death. And something interesting happens to Wolf in this ending. He has a real choice for the first time in his life, and he chooses to stay the course to put an end to the suffering of others. There's a term in Buddhism for that. For someone who travels through the cycle, obtains enlightenment and then chooses not to ascend, but rather to stick around to teach others and lessen their suffering. Bodhisattva. The idea of a bodhisattva, of someone who overcomes the cycle of suffering, lifts themselves out of the process, and then reverses and chooses to stay behind to teach others to alleviate their pain, is horrifyingly twisted in Elden Ring with the story of Godwyn the Golden, the Prince of Death. Elden Ring follows in the footsteps of its predecessors, where the story begins, chronologically, with the player character being attached to the cycle of suffering, death, and rebirth. The literal incarnation of the cycle of the world in Elden Ring is the Elden Ring itself, and, assuming you pre-ordered the game, acquiring the Ring gesture is the very first interaction of the game post-character creation. Afterwards, the player leaves the Chapel of Anticipation, fights a boss, dies, and then revives on the mainland where they begin their adventure. Across the history of the lands between, the favor of the Two Fingers has shifted to different monarchs who reforge the Elden Ring in different ways. This is one incarnation of a cyclical way of life. Another would be Erdtree Resurrection itself. Because Marika removed death from the Elden Ring, those who die are repurposed by the Erdtree and they go on forever. Live, suffer, die, rebirth. What Marika expels from the makeup of the Elden Ring is not destroyed, like how impurities are not destroyed by a river, only moved. And so, immortality, as the case is in Dark Souls, as it is in Sekiro, results in a stagnant life, and impurities become more and more powerful the longer the state of stagnation persists. And alternate ways of addressing the failures in Elden Ring crop up to fill the void left by death. The Scarlet Rot, the Glowmite Queen and the Black Flame, Dung Eater and the Seedbed Cursed, and Godwyn and Deathblight. The events of the game are kicked off with his murder. First of the demigods to fall, but only partly. His soul has been destroyed, but his adopted sister Ranni paid for the death of his body with her own, such that her spirit can move unshackled by the greater will and the Two Fingers. But as Ranni studies the wonders of the moon and the enlightenment it harbors, Godwyn fares much worse. Both are free from the cycle of the world, in a sense, but Godwyn is stuck behind. His remains are, at least, and rest perched at the roots of the Erdtree, where, like any real seedbed, he festers, rots, and corrupts the land. But his corruption is different because it's death. Dung Eater's corruption and the Scarlet Rot's corruption might function to give an alternative to suffering, and might impart some semblance of structure back into humanity's life, but Godwyn actually fixes the problem. So like a Bodhisattva, he has escaped the cycle of the world, but persists within its flow to offer relief to others who struggle. But he does it through no will of his own, which is such a dark premise. Certainly it's the darkest incarnation of the Bodhisattva idea I've seen FromSoft implement. Usually the Bodhisattva is a cool guy, like the Monumental, except he was a cool girl. And so was the Slayer of Demons if you chose to put the old one back to slumber. The soul arts drift from the world, and we stay behind as a Monumental, holding the fabric of reality together and waiting to offer guidance should the old one ever be awakened again. Another example of a twisted Bodhisattva might be seen in Gehrman. It's not a perfect translation, but bear with me. He's the guide to all hunters linked to the dream, and he teaches the path out over and over again as the cycle of the hunt repeats itself. Of course, he is the plaything of an evil moon demon, but I think the connection is warranted. A much cleaner example would be Kotaro from Sekiro. He asks us to spirit him away so he can reunite with the slain Senpu children in the afterlife, and when we find him, he's talking to them and teaching them the way of the Buddha. A bodhisattva is about the holiest saintly thing a person can aspire to, so it's kind of cruel to think about how his fate can be twisted if we send him to collect loot from corpses instead. Compare these ideals of a bodhisattva, and Gehrman, and Wolf, to Godwyn. With the concept fully in mind, isn't it kinda crazy to see how well Godwin fits the mold, even though in his case, the divine ideal is so horrifying and so evil? The instability of order breeds opposition to the prevailing order. The opposition will be inclined to those factors which were expunged from the order, and so the cyclical nature of Marika's order will face hardships specifically born to address the problems she made. That's the larger, more cosmic cycle, but within any given order there's a cyclical aspect to life, because the constants in human nature reappear, and superior, more competitive modes of living and engaging with one another manifest over and over again across time. With the passing of one cosmic cycle to another, large changes are imposed on the nature of life, but that every single order has been broken speaks to a faction having had a dissatisfaction great enough to throw off the chains of the old order. That dissatisfaction speaks to a suffering, and that it happens in every iteration of the Elden Ring seems to suggest that in the lands between, suffering is innate to being. Every order breathes dissatisfaction by some with some component of it, because the establishment of order is the expulsion of non-harmonious elements. Everything can, seemingly, not be made to fit together under the Empyrean Elden Lord structure without creating conflict, and the urge to destroy the old is driven by the hatred someone has for the injustices which the reigning order has committed. Queen Marika was born a Numen in the shaman village during the reign of the Hornsent and the Crucible. The Crucible was a wild and chaotic order where life was abundant and degenerate, and its Hornsent adherents persecuted the shamans for the sake of their skin. The Tooth Whip's item description affirms as much. It reads, "Whip bestrewn with rotting, misshapen teeth. Filthy and seething with disease, the teeth are embedded in the whip, and dose the victim with deadly poison upon each strike. As the wounds ripen, they grow inflamed and ooze pus. The flesh of shamans was set to melt harmoniously with others." For the cult of the Crucible, the ability to merge all life elegantly was worth sacrificing the shamans. In fact, they believed, at least some of them, maybe not all, they believed that the shaman's place in life was to be stuffed inside the pots, crushed and melted together with other life. And nothing else. Adherents to the order of the Crucible imposed suffering on innocents for the sake of their desire for the world, independent of the wishes of others. Is the melding of all life the natural state? Why then would some reject that? Whatever the case, Marika did reject it, and she waged a war against the Hornsent. In victory, she brandished the Elden Ring and began the era of the Earth Tree. Deviant life was put down with strength. Hence, her Elden Lord, Godfrey. His and Marika's shared era was an era of strength where they put down all forces that could oppose them. But the era of strength didn't last, because after all opposition had been strangled, there was nothing justifying this order any longer. And so, Godfrey was exiled, and Marika called in her other self Radagon to be Elden Lord, so that the next era could be an era of understanding. She had acquired the Elden Ring, she had destroyed all who could take it away from her, now it was time to understand it. But Marika ran afoul of the same problem that had always plagued Empyreans, and which her adopted daughter Ranni would rebel against. See, Marika's ambition to rule was organically spurned by her aversion to the torment inflicted by the Hornsent and the Crucible. She wanted to escape that, and the dominance of the greater will wasn't that, as she learned when Godwin was slain. She was confronted with the reality that suffering cannot be averted by simply removing death from the order of the world. Maybe it wasn't the Crucible, per se, but the Elden Ring itself. The idea of the cyclical nature of life and the inherent presence of suffering in people's lives. And so, Marika told the demigods to fight for the right to rule, and then she shattered the Elden Ring. For her transgression against the greater will, she is crucified on an arc rune. The very rune she pulled from the Crucible god she slew to achieve godhood. The resolutions to the conflict in Elden Ring are interesting. The possible outcomes are not preordained or chosen in a binary. The makeup of the world can take any shape, and so the game has 6 endings. 4 of them are different possible outcomes for a new makeup of the Elden Ring. To reforge it, to incorporate the mending rune of the Prince of Death into it and thus allow death to re-enter the cycle, to perfect the Order with Gold Mask's mending rune and thus abolish all contradictions of the Order which lead to disparities and suffering, to inject the curse of the Dung Eater into the Order, thus barring the entrance of cursed souls into the Erd Tree and reimposing death that way, assuring that anyone ever born hereafter will be marked by the impure seedbed curse such that the Erd Tree will accept them no longer. And then there are 2 alternate endings, the Lord of Frenzied Flame and the Age of the Stars. In the former, the Erd Tree is burnt with a frenzied flame and madness is allowed to take over the world. In the latter, we join Ranni in the pursuit of enlightenment and freedom from the greater will. I tend to think the Age of Stars ending, the Ranni ending, is the best ending, but I can't help think about how the path towards enlightenment and the overcoming of suffering is paid for with Godwyn's soul. If Ranni's order works out, the cycle will no longer be imposable, because people will no longer be linked to it. And still, Godwyn will linger in the world, incapable of moving on or following his sister to the future he was sacrificed to build. When I discussed the various Bodhisattvas in these games, I specifically didn't name a single example from Dark Souls. That's because there aren't any. The cycle in Dark Souls is not something you can awaken from, and the suffering can't be ended with a full understanding within the cycle of the world. The cycle itself is a lie, and it's the source of torment rather than being born from it, and so alleviating suffering in any real sense can't be done by waking up. The Nameless King tries, Big Head Logan tries, but they can't make it work, because you need to actually release the restraints of the world and allow for fire to die. You can't remedy the world by trying to clutch to the order before the one you find yourself in. If that order had worked, it would not have been supplanted in the first place. How are you going to revive the Age of the Dragons when the thing that killed it is still around? Fire fades, but disparity persists. And so the structure which allowed for the Reign of the Dragons doesn't exist anymore. It's wishful thinking, but in these games, when there is a conflict between appealing to the old or embracing the new, we see that the latter is always the option the game deems to be more correct. The cycle of life, suffering, death, and rebirth is overcome by detaching oneself from it entirely. Applied to a grander cosmological level, as the case is in these games, this detachment is not necessarily freedom, but rather an appeal to harmony and a world where suffering is not innate. But what that sort of life looks like, and what we look like at the other side, is an open question. The overcoming of the cycle of the world invites us into a completely different way of living. In Dark Souls, the truth of humankind will be revealed. In Armored Core 6, humanity will be left behind. The cycle there is born from human impulses, and so there is no way to rise above it without abandoning what made us human in the first place. Armored Core 6 begins with us descending to Rubicon 3. We navigate around the closure system, a big laser eye surrounded by rings connected to a larger ring orbiting the entire planet. Our descent has us breach the shield of space by inserting ourselves within the border of this incredibly huge ring. Of every example of us being linked with a ring which connects us to the cycle of suffering, death, and rebirth, this is the weakest example I've named in this video, but there's another prominent-ish ring imagery in the game which I hope makes up for this. The wheel on the banner of the Rubicon Liberation Front, which actually maps up to the Dharma wheel, what with the 8 grips symbolizing the Noble Eightfold Path, which describes the Buddhist path to liberation. Right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. The Rubicon Liberation Front sports this wheel in their banner, and their resolve is directed towards thwarting the efforts of the corporations and their continued exploitation of their home planet. The cycle of the world in Armored Core 6 is the cycle of Coral and the Scorching of Rubicon 3. Previous Armored Core games concerned themselves much more with the cycle of the mech economy, the pursuit of money and power, and how humanity was doomed to find itself in this conflict regardless of the makeup of the world. The mech economy is there in Fires of Rubicon, but it's not nearly as prominent a driving feature. It is for the companies, but not really for us. The companies go to Rubicon because they see opportunities for profit and power, but human activities awaken the coral, which threatens to alter irrevocably the nature of life across the universe, and so, long ago, Rubicon was burnt to destroy the coral. But it didn't take. Residue lingered in the world, and when humanity returned to the planet, it had regenerated. Or I should say, because the coral had regenerated, humanity returned, driven by the desire for profits and power. And so the ambition of the separate parties of the world are all put at odds as they deal with the cycle of the coral once again. The game has 3 endings. In the Fires of Raven ending, we aim to pilot the Xylem City into the vascular plant to ignite all the harvested coral and scorch the galaxy again. Before the collision, Rusty intervenes and fights us on the Xylem. He talks about the injustices and suffering which invaders to Rubicon have inflicted upon it, but in the end, Raven overcomes and destroys him. Afterwards, Air arrives in her coral-infused AC and fights us to save the coral. She loses as well, and the vascular plant is then destroyed and the cosmos is lit aflame with the coral. The Planetary Closure Administration then seals off the planet for good, and the cycle of the Rubicon War is ended. Of course, should coral be rediscovered here again, the tendencies of men to lust for power will undoubtedly reignite the corporate desires for further excavations, and the cycle will reinsert itself. If we choose to liberate Rubicon, we fight alongside Rusty to stop the Xylem, and as we fight Snail, Rusty is killed by Handler Walter. In the end, we confront Handler Walter, who has been augmented with coral and has had his brain tampered with. In the end, he chooses not to take a final shot at us, recognizing that we've found a friend in Air, and after the battle, she and C4621 both return to Rubicon. In the third and final ending, the AC AI Allmind becomes a prominent character. Allmind perpetuates the cycle of the mech economy because every AC pilot and faction interacts through it. It has a sentience of its own and has its own ideas. In the third ending, it intends to release the coral to make it bond with humanity and itself. In the new world, the boundary of existence would be blurred, and Allmind would become an irremovable component of existence. After it betrays us, we fight back against it, and along with Air, we ultimately destroy it and then release the coral ourselves. We then wake up in the sea alongside a number of other ACs, and watch as the cosmos is bathed in coral as the new future awaits us, having escaped from the cycle of the old age. And then Air ominously says,
"Main system, activating combat mode."
An interesting thing about Armored Core 6 in the context of this specific video is that the Alea Iacta Est ending is not unlocked from the get-go. You have to beat the game and then beat it again to do this. In other words, you have to be fed through the cycle of suffering so that you can learn to step above it. This isn't the only time FromSoft has emphasized the hold the cycle has over the world with New Game Plus, though typically it's not this overt. It's things like enemies getting tougher, which you can read as symbolic of how the perpetuation of the cycle perpetuates suffering, but which is almost certainly just intended as a gameplay consideration for those who are attached, to their character and want to go through the game again. But Armored Core 6's use of New Game Plus might be the most interesting use of this wanting to re-experience the world desire for the players to hammer home the presence of the cycle of suffering we'd seen up to this point, with one exception. Demon Souls, Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring all have to stand as singular works. Armored Core 6 is like the 20th AC game, but even then, it's the first one in a decade, and it's the biggest stylistic departure from the conventional AC identity established and evolved by former steward of the series, Toshifume Nabeshima. But Dark Souls has the benefit of being a series, and as a series, it gets to re-explore the cycle of the world as it is perpetuated across time in a way the other games cannot. Dark Souls 3 puts a lid on things, but it's capped off with an expedition to the Ringed City, and in exploring the cycle of the world, and perhaps only in this context, the Ringed City is an unquestionable masterpiece. At the end of the world, at the end of everything, there is the Ringed City. Gwyn promised his daughter Filianor that he would come back for her one day, but he never did. The world that lingered on after he ruled his age bears the mark of the cycle of suffering. Centuries of the delusion have passed, and the tangibility and presence of the Order of Fire is becoming shakier. Once mankind was branded by Gwyn to separate the stragglers who wandered from the Ringed City from those who stayed behind. The Darksign made men mortal, and as all the institutions outside of the Ringed City, and within the Ringed City, were controlled by Gwyn and his clan, men began to forget their true nature and revere him. Fire faded, and the Darksign weakened. Men reclaimed their immortality, but they had been made to imprint on the souls they collected, and not on their own dark soul. As they revived after death, they did so without soul power, and so lost contact with who they were. They can be sustained by will and by purpose, but neither of those can last eternally against the suffering they face, because no matter how hard they try, suffering cannot be averted while the Age of Fire persists. As suffering has spread, and the Age of Fire has weakened, the sky has become marked with the Darksign as the moon eclipses the sun, and the Ashen One reawoke to seek soul power to collect the embers of the Lords and to reignite the first flame again. Before we decide the fate of the first flame, we're given the choice to go to the Ringed City. It lies at the end of the world, and when we get there, we are met with a pygmy who tells us that the city is an illusion and gives us our heading.
Seek Filianor's church at the base of the cliff. There wilt thou the sleeping princess waken. Her slumber is a deceit, a lid covering an overgrown privy, a prop to keep thee from the dark soul of thine desire.
In Japanese, Filianor's name would be pronounced Firi Anor, and in Sindarin, it means son of mortal man. Fitting name for the daughter Gwyn gifted to mankind. The statue where we loot the Chloranthy ring +3 is that metaphor. The Chloranthy ring increases stamina regeneration, which we can infer to represent vitality. And so Gwyn gifting a man the ring is symbolic for him gifting mankind his daughter to ensure the vitality of the city. But the world is breaking down, and all Filianor is really doing is painting over the decay. The Age of Fire is a delusion, and if the pygmies attach themselves to the delusion, so much the better for Gwyn. The cycle of the world is perpetual suffering caused by attachment, and in the Ringed City, there are two character stories I want to go over to illustrate this idea applied to Dark Souls storytelling. The story of Patches and the story of Gale. Channel regulars will have heard me say this many times over the years, but I really like it when the unique quirks of a work are used within the work for narrative progression. The stories of Patches, the Unbreakable, and Slave Knight Gale are both great for exploring the ramifications of the whole Samsara theme, but also because they both very much lean on Dark Souls' unique quirks in ways that prop up Dark Souls storytelling as different, and in ways that make their characters more interesting. When we meet Patches in the Dreg Heap, he has lost his memories and goes by Lap. He's a mild-mannered and friendly fellow who is aware of his own memory loss, and he sets us up for classic Patches hijinks, but without the betrayal at the end. In fact, if you don't follow up on his lead in the swamp, he'll fetch the Titanite slab for you. The story of Lap is the story of Hollowing and the Curse. He wields the Curse Ward Great Shield, whose item description reads, Great Shield, given to those who resisted the curse long ago. Far too heavy for an ordinary person, perhaps it signifies the foolishness of resisting the curse. And yet, those who bear the weight of this shield will not find its protections against curses wanting. This description is tricky because the games use curses in more than one context. It's not describing the status ailment, but rather the undead curse. It protects one from hollowing, which makes a lot more sense for why Patches is lugging it around, than if it helped when fighting basilisks. The characters we meet in Dark Souls are usually deluded and on a crazy mission which renders them purposeless and doomed. Patches, or Lap, is searching for the purging monument which is used to reverse hollowing, and if we help him find it, he'll regain his memories and kick us down some stairs after promising us treasure. But he doesn't stick around to loot our corpse like he usually does. And he's actually putting us on the correct path to advance and put an end to the illusion of Filianor. After kicking us down, he says something interesting.
Every age, it seems, is tainted by the greed of men. Rubbish to one such as I, devoid of all worldly wants. I don't know. Maybe it's just the way we are. I'll stick you in my prayers. A fine dark soul to you.
This line, coupled with his moniker, The Unbreakable, could connect to the cycle of the world theme, because through desire, men can be linked to the cycle of death and rebirth, and Patches manages to stick around because he doesn't have any desires. In fact, although he didn't know he was Patches when he was Lap, he was shown to have overcome the greed of men just like Patches claims he himself has. He gave us the Titanite slab, after all. And he voluntarily re-embraces his old self and then helps us out. The stairs he kicks us down is a puzzle. They spiral up and down, and Patches, literally, kicks us out of the cycle that has us trapped so that we can move on, making him the video's final contender for being a Bodhisattva. Someone who detaches themselves from the cycle but stays within the flow of the world in order to teach others how to escape it themselves. Slave Knight Gale is significant as the series' final boss, aside from the Soul of Cinder, because he's an undead, just like us, who has been taken to the absolute breaking point of human existence. If you kill him as an NPC, he will respawn, and won't be hostile when you meet him next. Not only will he not be hostile, he also doesn't lose his sanity upon death, because his will is so strong that he can endure death and rebirth. Gale wears the Slave Knight set, and its description reads, Armor issued to slave knights, the fine craftsmanship made this a symbol of honor. Long ago, only the undead served as slave knights, warriors used as fodder in the bleakest of battles. They grew decrepit, their skin charred black and their bones twisted. Eventually they went outright mad, but they were never relieved from duty. And Gale wields the executioner's sword, whose item description reads, Greatsword of a debauched executioner used for beheadings. This sword retains a keen memory of its executioner's duty and absorbs FP from each fallen foe. As a slave knight, Gale would have been sent to the battlefields over and over again, but he never lost his senses. His sword absorbs the FP, focus points, of his victims, is the idea that with each kill, Gale absorbed the lingering will of his victims. There's some overt symbolism with how, when we fight Gale, his sword has been chipped and has lost its ability to recover focus points. If you use the Hollow Slayer Greatsword in this battle, during phase 2, you will get the hollow damage buff to activate, so the sword which recovered his senses after a kill is broken, and so he has lost his senses. But I don't think he was kept together literally because he had a magical sword. I think it was his duty and his belief in throwing himself at the problem in front of him, no matter what the consequences would be. The Japanese name for his weapon art, the Blade of Peril, actually supports this, and it has two meanings. One is to put one's life on the line, but the other is to act out of desperation. This part of the text means abandoned self, and although it is meant in the context of throwing one's body into the obstacle ahead and disregarding all sense of one's own safety, even though the context is violent, the sentiment has a real Buddhist flair to it. Gale puts everything on the line, even when he doesn't think he has a chance of success. The item description for his soul reads, "The red-hooded wandering slave knight Gale sought the blood of the Dark Soul as a pigment for the painted world, but Gale knew he was no champion, that the Dark Soul would likely ruin him, and that he had little hope of a safe return." Just like Solaire and the other NPCs, Gale loses his will and his sanity because the suffering which the cycle of the world imposes on him becomes too great, and the delusion he holds on to can no longer keep him focused or give him a reason to go on. Despairing is how these characters are undone. Solaire becomes a host for parasites. Siegmeyer is denied his glorious heroic adventure and end. Big Head Logan loses his mind in the Duke's archives. But Patches stuck around in the world because he is devoid of all worldly want, and because he doesn't hold on to delusions to keep himself going. Gale doesn't go hollow because he ate the Dark Soul, he goes hollow because he sees the blood of the Dark Soul within himself. He sees that the pigment he sought for his lady is there, but he cannot give it to her without dying. This is when he finally lets go. Interestingly, even though Gale is so cosmetically and narrative-wise linked to the idea of cycles, he himself is not deluded by the fire-linking lie. For emphasis, he throws the circular-shaped Way of White Corona miracle, his repeating crossbow has a wheel attached to it, and its item description speaks to an endless journey. His sword also speaks to countless battles, and his abdomen has gone concaved after he absorbed the Dark Soul. But his mission has nothing to do with his belief in Gwyn or fire. Instead, he is loyal to his lady. And because he's a gentle soul who just follows orders, he fares much better in the world than most, because he doesn't harbor any great self-destructive delusions, and his missions keep him from going hollow. When he realizes that he has the pigment of the Dark Soul, he also realizes that only we can finish his mission for him, so he lets go, and in his place, he leaves his mad body and impulses to flail around and instinctively defend from us. In the end, he was destroyed, but his life showcases probably the best possible outcome one can hope for under the fire-linking system. If you follow the path set before you by the fire-linking adherents, you will die numerous times to eventually burn yourself up and perpetuate the suffering of the world. If you try to overcome the curse of the world, you will go hollow when you recognize that there is no choice to be made other than letting fire fade. If you choose to not link the fire, but do not embrace the dark, you will become like Aldrich, and you fester and stagnate and rot along with the world. Gale goes on unlinked from the cycle of the world directly, and his story ends at the end of the world. Aside from perhaps the Great Caravan and the victims of the Frenzied Flame, aside from the Yarnamites and the other assorted bit players, in general, the characters we encounter in these games are knowingly going against the natural law and the horrors which this breach of sacred social and cosmological boundaries produces is on them, is known to them, and is overlooked or accepted by them in the pursuit of their ultimate end. But in Dark Souls, humankind is deliberately deluded to believe that the more they suffer, the more they perpetuate the cycle of suffering, the more they do to alleviate their suffering. Maybe we should note, though, that Gwyn didn't do this in order to make people suffer. I think he actually just wanted to perpetuate his age. If he could have done it without making mankind suffer, maybe he would have, but I also think he didn't lose much sleep over what he did. In Dark Souls, the origin of suffering has really nothing to do with the people. At least, it didn't organically grow from them. All the same, they perpetuate the cycle of suffering, and so, they suffer. In these games, the conflicts born by the dispersed cycles of the worlds are ultimately all undone because the cyclical nature of suffering, death, and resurrection allow us to try again and again until we overcome. But it doesn't matter if we keep going. The world is never truly static so long as someone has the will to go on, and in these games, that is how the cycle of death, rebirth, and suffering is eventually overcome. People have the ability to overcome. Demigods and animals do not. Not in Buddhism, anyways. The suffering which demigods suffer is subtle, the suffering of animals is intense. Demigods strive for dominance and are plagued by envy and a lack of contentment. Animals are ignorant and so cannot elevate their condition through understanding. But people are different. The cycle of the world is the context of suffering, but it's imposed on people, not born from them. They can choose.
What do you want? Color? Light? Dark? Or something else entirely?
In the next Themes of Fromsoft video, I'm going to elaborate on the idea of suffering. Join me then in the series finale when we discuss hell in the games of From Software. If you want to support the making of this series or just show appreciation for it as well as watch the videos ahead of the channel's release schedule, consider joining the channel Patreon over at patreon.com/medievalmegaman. If you have any questions, I hope you leave them in the comment section, as I'm still planning on a Q&A livestream for each of these videos. I know I haven't yet come through with the ones for Enlightenment or Madness, but they're on the to-do list. As you can imagine, these videos are a commitment to assemble, and my work is made easier with the efforts of the larger FromSoft community. For this video, I'd like to thank my pal Lokey for helping me out with the accurate translations and lore on Firelinking, Dark Souls, and the Ringed City and Gale. His channel and his website are a treasure trove for FromSoft fans, and I hope you give him a look into. I'd also like to thank Quesadiv and recommend you check out her channel. I can always rely on her when I'm in need of lore or philosophy clarifications. The links to these channels are in the description box below, along with all other assorted informations, videos, and links. I'm AesirAesthetics. 4 down, 1 more to go. See you in the next video.